Welcome back to Geoscientists Voices, a project where we explore the humans behind the headlines of Earth science. Today, we have a truly special guest joining us from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. Dr. Aaron Micallef is a marine geoscientist and a National Geographic explorer who has spent his career uncovering the mysteries of the deep sea. He has just returned from leading the FLAIR expedition in Antarctica, where his team achieved a historic first ever marine electromagnetic survey of the Antarctic seafloor. Aaron, it is an absolute honor to have you with us.
Likewise, thank you so much.
As I mentioned, you recently led the scientific expedition in the Bransfield Basin in Antarctica, and it is a great achievement by any measure and sounds to me and to I'm sure many like a dream come true. But if we quickly go back to the beginnings of your career, what was the specific spark or a moment in your youth, probably, that drew you to geosciences and when did it happen?
That's funny. I think it maybe all started when I was 4 or 5 years old. So I come from Malta, which is a small little island in the middle of the Mediterranean. And we had a particular fruit juice that used to come with stickers that used to collect in an album. And most of these were either animals or really beautiful landscapes. And I was really fascinated by the photos of these beautiful landscapes. There were like canyons, forests, volcanoes, lakes, beautiful oceans. So I think the spark was that one. It's the aesthetic beauty of landscape that drew me to geosciences initially. But I never thought, oh, I want to become a marine geoscientist. I knew I wanted to work in something related to the environment. And as I progressed through school and then through university, it sort of pointed me towards marine geoscience. So actually, initially, I started as a desert geomorphologist. So quite the opposite of what I'm doing nowadays. That was like my undergrad and also my master's. And it was only during my master's when I had just a 2-hour lecture from Professor Dennis Bransden that introduced me to the world of marine geomorphology and marine geoscience. And I was hooked. So I wanted to do a PhD. And since then, I've basically been working underwater. Sometimes I venture on shore again, but mostly it's marine geomorphology.
Wow, what an adventure and what a transition. And you said that you started, I mean, you're from Malta, which is in Mediterranean, which is pretty warm sea, and now you transition to being close to
Yes.
South Pole, which is like totally opposite of Mediterranean
Yeah, there
nature
shouldn't
and
be any Maltese really going there, right? But yes, I ended up almost like it wasn't even planned. I like this expedition that you talked about was my third in Antarctica, and it all started about a couple of years ago when I had an opportunity with the Lindblad expeditions and National Geographic to go there for the first time. And as everything, whenever you do something, there's new ideas, new questions coming up, which brought me again and again going back to this beautiful place.
but let's talk anyway about your latest expedition because
Hmm.
your work during it combined high resolution seafloor mapping with deep geophysical observations. So the question is, was there a specific subsurface legacy or maybe a hidden structure you've encountered on this trip that totally changed how you view the stability of the Antarctic shelf? And like generally, what was the main revelation of this cruise?
So the main objective for us was to understand fluid flow systems in Antarctica and how they impact the seafloor and potentially even the biological systems. And this all started from the fact that Antarctica, as many other, and polar regions in general, have quite complex hydrogeological systems. So there's different kind of fluids in different phases. There can be in gas format and liquid and even in solid, and you have fresh water, methane, and other gases. And what's happening is that, especially our study area, which is the Western Antarctic Peninsula, is one of the sites that are undergoing most warming anywhere on the planet. So these changes in temperature are going to result in a cascading effect if any of these fluids change phase and start flowing in a different way. So this is like what brought us to this Antarctic expedition in the first place. And what we were trying to do especially in the last one was, first of all, identify sites where different kind of fluids exist, and we wanted to understand what they are, why they are there, and in what state they might be, and if there's any evidence of their changing. And we chose some sites in King George Island, near the Astrolabe Shelf, and you also had the opportunity to go to Deception Island because of bad weather, but that's also an interesting story in itself. And to be honest, like the geophysical data that we have so far have some indications of where past fluid flow might have happened. We need to wait for the electromagnetic data to be processed and inverted, and that takes a little bit of time. But I think the most fascinating discoveries were actually from the sediment gravity cores, which is the most simple, oldest technology that we had on board. It's very, very simple to deploy. There's indications of freshening. And so some of the pore water is fresher than the seawater that's surrounding it. And that, I think, was like the most interesting discovery, because it's either pointing to potentially permafrost, that is submarine and melting, which is something that we observed also in the Arctic during an expedition with our Korean colleagues in 2025. Or perhaps it's actually offshore groundwater that is coming from onshore, and that's suggesting potential changes in the groundwater flow, maybe associated to melting ice. And this is something that we want to hopefully understand by geochemical analysis of these pore water samples.
So, could you explain what it means in terms of basically climate change and why understanding these hidden fluid systems beneath Antarctic floor is so critical to predicting basically the continent's future and in the climate that is basically warming today?
So I think there's two aspects. The first one is sort of think of it like the canary in the mine, right? Because if we start seeing significant changes in these parts of the world, which are, so far away from where our impact should be affecting the seafloor, we should really start worrying. And I'm thinking about, let's say that you have a coastline where you have an ice sheet and potentially have some submarine permafrost that was there from like previous sea level lows then. So periods where sea level was lower than today. And we are seeing that either the permafrost is melting or there is more offshore groundwater, which are the two hypotheses that I mentioned earlier. It could mean that either the seawater is actually increasing in temperature, resulting in the degradation of the permafrost, and actually it's melting. Or perhaps the onshore system, as I said, the groundwater system is changing because either you have more melting of the ice that's making it into the ground and then flowing out at sea, or perhaps you have more rainfall. And we know of some sites where we see more rainfall than previously documented in Western Antarctica. So if we're seeing these changes, like in the seafloor as well, we're actually demonstrating that the impact of climate change is, of course, farther away from just our shores, but it's actually affecting some of the most remote places on the planet, and of this associated with that. So I think that's like the part related to, as I said, to the canary in the mine. But also, if we have these changes offshore, maybe the fluid systems are also being impacted at larger scales. And perhaps we have some areas, as an example, again, this is not something we demonstrated so far, although we do see some methane seeps close to where we have these pore water freshening. There might be permafrost melting, allowing for more gas to make it into the water column and potentially into the atmosphere. So you have implications for carbon budgets as well that we need to consider, and perhaps we haven't considered well enough in our numerical models that can predict how climate change might happen in the future.
So first, is climate warming happening on the scale that is faster than it would have been with the like before, and if the anthropogenic factor is really a big force in it?
So I'm not an expert in the field. I'm just read other people's studies. But the impression that I get from reading these studies is yes for both those questions. And I think most of this can be seen visually if you go to Antarctica. I mean, even like if you go, just been there a few times, but one season after the other, and you do see different, like big changes, especially in ice cover. And I've seen it also in other places around the world. It doesn't have to be Antarctica. Like you see the impacts in ice cover like very significantly. And I think there you feel it even more because it's one of these last remote untouched places. For me, it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. And it's a real like heartbreak seeing these changes within such a short period of time.
On the positive side, as you said, Antarctica is still, and for many years to come, hopefully, will be one of the most stunning but yet fragile places on Earth.
Mhm.
So, Aaron, as someone who sees the direct evidence of climate change that you described and in other people's articles and in data every day, how do you balance the scientific detachment needed for research with the emotional or philosophical weight of witnessing these rapid shifts in person? Because you said you love Antarctica and
Mhm.
probably it's maybe hard for you to get these results which are not maybe positive in terms of the rate of the climate change. So does it
Mhm.
change your view? uh, does it change how you view our responsibility to the planet as well?
I think it does, but as a scientist, I try to keep it objective and just concentrate on numbers. As I said, when I go back and I see such a rapid change within a few years, it does make it difficult to watch. But I try to detach from that and just try to keep the emotion away and focus really on what the data are telling us. And I'm sure many other scientists do that, especially those that are advocating for climate change as happening at present. I think what it really does also, it as scientists strengthens our responsibility because we're not really, I mean, some of us do, but our role is not really advocacy. It's really providing clarity to the general public and decision makers with facts that can help develop policies. And I think if I try to keep it that way, even if it's hard, I think my contribution will have a larger impact than if I'm more in a having an advocacy role. So I try to do that. I'm not sure whether I'm successful or whether it's impactful enough, but I hope it does work in a positive way.
This expedition was a massive achievement, and traveling to Antarctica sounds like a challenge, at least to me, and I think to many other people as well. But I want to ask you, what has been the single greatest hurdle, whether academic, technical, or personal, generally in your scientific
Mhm.
life, that you had to overcome during your career to establish yourself in the field of geosciences?
So, especially for this Antarctic expedition, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I need to thank Polarin, which is an EU project that provides polar infrastructure to scientists. So without them, this wouldn't have been possible. And I think this is also mirrors like the answer to my question because unfortunately, marine geoscience is an expensive endeavor. So you need lots of funds and very expensive equipment, sometimes very complex. And I do come from a country where it's very small. Our research budget is very small compared to that of other European and other countries. So I think the biggest hurdle for me was trying to turn these sort of complex, high risk scientific ideas into reality in an environment where resources, logistics, and perhaps even collaboration, because we are few in Malta, are not always easy. And at the time when I was still in Malta, I could do the work that I wanted to do primarily in two main ways. Through funding from the EU, because luckily EU funds are available to all the members, and also trying to rely on the generosity of other colleagues from other countries who have access to that infrastructure. So this is really how I started and still do that nowadays, although I'm in a luckier place because I have better access to infrastructure at Imbari and also in the US. And I'm very grateful and totally appreciate that. But I think it's the access to infrastructure that I saw as a big hurdle for me, but also other people from, especially from developing countries or especially from the global south, with whom I'm working a lot in recent times, and I appreciate more the hazard that they have now that I've sort of I'm on the other side and I have more access than I did in the past.
Well, I mean, you chose for yourself really an expensive area of
Yes.
research. Traveling to Antarctica, I don't know what can be more expensive. So I'm glad you could find funds for it. I don't know. I think you can run a masterclass or something how to fund multiple expeditions to Antarctica. Maybe I would use that. I would also go there. So um, yeah, but by the way, I really want to ask this follow-up question because I'm
Mhm.
not kidding. I know that how it is hard for many researchers to secure funding, even for research in the nearby seas or just
Yes.
across the fence. And what life hack would you tell to people who want to find fundings for such huge endeavors and they don't
Mhm.
know where to start? So what would you tell them that might change their perspective on this really hard and complex business of finding money for the research?
Mhm. I think it's people need to be creative and flexible because some of the field works that can be done, and also in my case, weren't like the typical scientific project where you apply for funding, you get the funds, and then you carry out the field work. As I said earlier, perhaps you might have to rely on international collaborations with people who have access to those resources. And I think that's one main lesson that I learned. So having a good network with whom you can share your ideas and your expectations and make your projects happen. But also, as I said, be a little bit creative because, for example, and this is, I think, something that's becoming more common nowadays. So, for example, the first time I went to Antarctica, it wasn't on a research vessel. It was on an expedition organized for paying guests who are going there for tourism purposes. And I was the scientist on board with another colleague. And initially, when I was planning the expedition, I thought, oh, this is going to be difficult to actually get some really good science from um, such an environment, such conditions. But actually, I have to say, for me, it was one of the most fulfilling and successful expeditions because we had an access to a Zodiac. And whilst the guests were actually doing their thing, visiting the onshore sites, my colleague and I were out on the Zodiac sampling, going exactly where we wanted, and we had up to 2, 3 hours at every site to do that. And that's something that you wouldn't achieve. I think it would be very difficult to achieve with a normal scientific expedition. So try to be creative in the ways that you can envisage to do field work, because I think there's many opportunities hidden around that are not always obvious at face value.
Yeah, well, that's really great advice, and I think collaboration is the key. And I want to ask you a question, which probably you partially answered before, but the FLAIR expedition, as you said, was a massive international effort involving partners like the University of Haifa, which is nice to hear because I am a
Yes,
graduate of
that's right.
the Marine Geosciences program of this university, and also institutions across Europe and the US. So, how did this global brain trust change the way we approach science in such a remote and extreme environment as Antarctica?
Well, I think Antarctica is such a complex environment that it forces collaboration. I don't think there's a single institution or person that can address all the questions alone. And really, this applies to all oceanography in general, but it's actually even more important if you go to Antarctica. So there's so many questions that need to be answered that are interrelated, but also the fact that you don't get an opportunity to go to Antarctica every day, that this collaboration is almost forced, as I said. And also is the fact that because you have so little time and you're acquiring limited data, you try to maximize and use it to its full potential, use the data to their full potential, and making sure that it's not just a geologist like me with very limited experience, but also geophysicists, oceanographers, biologists who are looking at this, I think the impact that can be achieved from such a data set would be much wider than if I were doing this on my own. And in our case, in the FLAIR expedition, I think I was by far the oldest one in the scientific team. So we try to have younger scientists, early career scientists, also, first of all, to have an opportunity to go to Antarctica, but more importantly, because of their expertise and their experience, they had lots to bring in to the expedition. And it was the case. I mean, without them, apart their expertise and skills, but especially their patience, because these expeditions require lots of flexibility. Sometimes you're just sleeping 2 hours a night because you need to be awake for a next deployment. And even in such difficult conditions, they were an amazing team, I have to say.
For the early career geoscientists and students watching this, like me and other people like me, um, and many of whom want to lead their own expedition. So, what is the most important piece of advice you can offer about navigating the challenges, scientific or otherwise, of a life dedicated to exploring the deep ocean?
That's a big question. I think um, they should focus primarily on curiosity. And this is really what drives my research. I know titles and positions are important, and sometimes projects are planned with an objective in mind, but I think people should always remain curious, because that's really what drives the biggest scientific discoveries in any field, and also in geoscience. And the second one would be resilience, especially because of the difficulty in accessing funds or the appropriate infrastructure. But most importantly, marine geoscience and in oceanography in general, expeditions tend to be logistically, scientifically, and even emotionally demanding. Sometimes you have to be out at sea for 6 to 8 weeks away from home, away from your family. And it's not something that everybody perhaps is ready to do. So being ready for those, and ready for the fact that, before we go on an expedition, I don't know how many plans we make, but as soon as you get on board, you're just going to make sure that all of those are going to be changed almost immediately, because you have to be so adaptive to the conditions in the area and on the vessel and the team that you have around you and the equipment. That I think resilience or flexibility would be the two most important qualities one should have. And I think the last one would be communication, because of course we're always willing to publish that in scientific journals, because that helps our CV. But we need to make sure that the discoveries are clearly communicated to the general public and to all stakeholders, really, because without that, I don't think the knowledge that we're generating will have the impact that it should.
Sure, yeah, communication I will specifically underline, because many people say that basically why I decided to do this interview series is also because of communication need that I feel for our field. And thank you so much for really explaining all these complex findings and theories in a really human way that I enjoy a lot. And thank you for the advices. So, and Aaron, finally, looking at the next generation of researchers worldwide, in just one single word, how do you describe the future of geosciences?
I think that would be, if I had to think just about one word, that would be essential, even more than it has been so far, because it's going to be central to how society understands and responds to hazards, to climate change, resources, and basically the sustainability of our oceans and our planet. And we're heading into big challenges in that regard. And I think geosciences in general will play a fundamental role in addressing those questions.
Aaron, totally agree with this word. It's more needed than in all the times before geoscientists. Thank you for underlining that, and thank you so much for your time and for sharing those insights. Hearing about the global brain trust and the emotional weight of witnessing Antarctica's changes firsthand really puts the importance of your work into perspective.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, and to our viewers, if you want to learn more about Aaron's work or follow the ongoing results of the FLAIR expedition, we've included all the relevant links in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more voices from across our planet.